Meantime, President Trump is taking sides in the political crisis brewing in Venezuela. He's announced his support for opposition leader Juan Guaido, who has declared himself the country's interim president. That led the embattled President Nicholas Maduro to demand all U.S. diplomats leave within 72 hours. The U.S. is telling those diplomats to stay there as thousands of Venezuelans take to the streets to demand Maduro step down. State Department reporter Christina Ruffini joined me earlier to break it all down.
Well, so the National Assembly is basically the only democratic institution left in the country. And Guaido is the head of the National Assembly, and there have been, months and months of protests. It really came to a frenzy yesterday where he kind of stood up and swore himself in and said, I am the representative of the people, raise your hand, swear yourselves in with me, to protect our country and go forward until we can get democracy in Venezuela. So after he did that, then you had countries kind of jumping on board or not jumping on board and saying, yeah, we're supporting this guy. And that's a really big deal to support someone who's not technically the head of a state. So, we'll have to see if it fuels a revolution or if it spawns more of a crackdown by Maduro and his army, which he still controls up until now.
Right. So sort of right now, Venezuela almost has sort of two presidents. Did it come as a surprise that the Trump administration was willing to back the opposition leader, Guaido?
I mean, the Trump administration has been pretty clear about its feelings about Maduro. I would say if they blame Iran for what ails the Middle East, they kind of blame Maduro for a lot of the problems in South and Central America. And that's because it has spurned this huge economic refugee crisis, and it's really impacting all the countries around it. It still was a little bit of a surprise because the U.S. in the modern era, and I'm going to emphasize the modern era, has been really reluctant to throw its weight behind opposition leaders. Think about the Arab Spring countries and how long it took President Obama to call for those leaders to step down. And that's because, as you know, in the past, the U.S. has had a long and pretty terrible history of intervening in revolutions and counter-revolutions in Latin America, Iran, Brazil, and even Venezuela. So it's a bit of a third rail of international diplomacy. However, with Maduro, I think the Trump administration made the calculation after Guaido swore himself in and declared that he was the interim president until free and fair elections could be held, that this was a good opportunity for the U.S. to say, you know what, we've had enough, we're with that guy.
We're with that guy. So the president and the White House officials have said that all options are on the table in terms of supporting this new regime. What might that mean?
Well, I mean, they've said all options are all options. They refuse to rule out a use of force. And we're really going to have to see, because that decision you mentioned earlier with us leaving U.S. diplomats in place really raises the stakes. And the U.S. is not going to let harm come to their diplomats. So in order to do that, force might be necessary at some point. Now, the officials I spoke to emphasized they want to use sanctions. They want to use diplomatic means. And I think they're hoping this international grouping of countries saying we support Guaido, not Maduro, will put pressure on Maduro to step down. However, you're not always dealing with a rational actor, and people make strange decisions when they're threatened and when they're panicked. So it's a bit of a gamble. But again, they wouldn't rule anything out.
And all of this is coming about primarily because of the economic instability in Venezuela?
I think so. When you have, as you know, Venezuela had a lot of oil money, right? So for a while things were good, you can often kind of push democracy aside in some of these social welfare states, right? Think about some of the Middle Eastern oil-rich nations where they're not so great with the democracy, they're not so great with the freedom of speech, but they have this, kind of client relationship with their people where they give a lot of welfare and a lot of benefits, and they essentially pay off the population to let them do what they want and have a more oppressive regime. You can do that until the money runs out. And there's been mismanagement, and sanctions have really had an impact. And we've had reporters go down there. Manuel Bojorquez went down with producer Jack Renault, and they did some great pieces where they were standing in line with someone trying to buy food, and the cost of the food doubled and tripled in the time it took them to get to the front of the line. So it's just simply unsustainable. There are 3 million refugees now in neighboring countries. That's 7 to 10% of the entire population. So when you look at, yes, it is a little bit out of step with the last couple years for a U.S. administration to endorse an opposition leader, but it's basically a failed state. So I think at this point they're hoping that they really don't have anything to lose by endorsing Guaido, because with Maduro, it's a failed state and it's not going to change. So a lot of countries are hoping by backing this opposition leader, they can start to pull out of this tailspin and maybe turn the economy around at some point.
So interesting. So much chaos. Christina, thank you so much.